Okay, on the notes.
Oh, that's okay. Good morning. Olweni. Sangunani. Uyemora. It is with pleasure that I stand before you, before this distinguished audience congregating here in the beautiful council chambers at the University of Zululand, Kwadlangezwa, and online with colleagues joining and members of the public from hopefully everywhere in the world. I am happy to welcome us to the second of the Vice Chancellor's webinar series for the year 2024. And it's gone 1 minute past 10 o'clock in Johannesburg, at Ongoye, in Cape Town, in Durban, in Kwamashu, in Kwamtetwa, at Umutu. Yes, here is the center of the world for us this morning. The special recognition to the leadership of the University of Zululand, Chairperson of Council in absentia, members of the Council, the Vice Chancellor, Professor Oliswa Mutose, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Professor Vuyokazi Nomlomo, Professor Kunene, Professor Jaka, Deans. I see already Professor Mtombela, Professor Krelin. I know the other deans. I see Professor Bekwanya. I know my own dean is joining us. She's either on her way or online already. I'm sure of that. Distinguished deputy deans, distinguished directors. I see the registrar, Mr. Mutilal. Dr. Mutilal, thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. Beg your pardon, Dr. Mutilal. And all our colleagues, heads of department who are here in person, colleagues who are joining us online, students, members of the public. Of course, not forgetting our distinguished guest for today, Dr. Alan Bosak. Yes. Another distinguished guest and host, Professor Sipo Siyepe. You are all welcome. Without further ado, I would like to invite for the official opening address our dear Vice Chancellor, Professor Oliswa Mutose.
Thank you. Program Director, Professor Akome. I think this has become the opportunity to call me in full name because of the powers vested in me.
Yes.
Greetings, Molweni, Sanibonani, Uyemori, University of Zululand Chairperson of Council, Ms. N. Kaluza, and all members of the University Council, the executive members of my team, Professor Kunene, Professor Nomlomo, and this morning guest team held up in an HR matter, Professor Jata, my management team, and Professor Dr. Motilal as my registrar, management committee members, my deans, deputy deans, and the dean of students, staff, and students of the University of Zululand, Professor Okome, who's also going to be acting as the chairperson of this session, Professor Siepe is a respondent and leading the deliberations forward. Most importantly, our guest speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Alan Bosak. I greet you all and thank you for joining this webinar. The title for today was a little bit tricky, but I tried to do my duty of making a welcome and introductory remarks on what we are going to be deliberating upon today. In this second of this year's webinar series, which seeks to center truth-telling as a revolutionary praxis, it is important to critically reflect on our thinking and worldviews if we are to avoid losing our way. By starting with this cautionary note, I'm prompted by the three sets of seemingly intractable controversies. On one hand, there is a contested notion of truth. On the other, there are unresolved questions about what constitutes a social revolution. And to the mix are the vexing uncertainties regarding how revolution and decolonization are to be understood in relation to each other. In short, Program Director, this is a topic which traverses a thickest of conceptual and philosophical terrains, fraught with the ever-present potential danger to dislodge one's orientation towards a chosen vision. Without preempting what I anticipate will trigger robust deliberations from the presentation by one of South Africa's liberation stalwarts, who are immensely honored and privileged to listen to Dr. Busa today. Allow me to anchor my words on the troika of concepts: truth, revolution, and decolonization. In an attempt to manage the disparate contestations around these concepts, I would elaborate my exploration by reference to the case of hashtag Fees Must Fall, which from now on I'll call it FMF campaigns some 10 years ago, where the students told the country and the world about their experiences in South African higher education. What they said and the actions they took disrupted the trajectory of the policies and practices in the sector. I find the FMF experience and legacy useful in developing a conceptual nexus that facilitates the gleaning of insights into how the three main concepts of today's topic interact and their relevance in enhancing the UniZulu decolonial project. I start by interrogating the linchpin idea of truth and truth-telling. Truth and truth-telling, a diversity of perspectives. It has been argued that the notion of truth has long intellectual history, which can be traced to classical Western empiricists and idealist debates, to which, up to the present day, there is no agreement. Some scholars even shy away from attempting to define it. And as Essay 2021 states that truth is, quote, a concept unlike any other, is a part of each and every propositional thought, unquote, that can be evaluated from truth and falsity. If we allow this line of reasoning, then the grounds for claiming to be telling truth becomes a focus for conversations. I now elaborate on the controversies by taking a brief conceptual glimpse to what I've suggested as secular as opposed to religious approaches to the phenomenon of truth. Got a priest today, so we can't do without God. Secular approaches to truth. The foregoing gives idea of the secular century of theorizing truth. Over the years, there has been substantial scholarship that has sought to understand the nature of truth and what practices are associated with it. Delving deep into these is outside the scope of my paper. Instead, I would like to build my narrative around the ideas emanating from what Custer's 2019 has characterized as one major framework of truth, the coherence and the correspondence view of truth. With regard to coherence, Chen argues that the truth is a relational attribute. In other words, in considering whether a proposition, idea, statement, hypothesis, and so on is true or needs to satisfy the condition that is actually represents what is the case in the real world, it must not contradict it. For example, if we were to claim inability to pay for basic service, while at the same time displaying a lifestyle that is not consistent with an indigent person, would it not be reasonable to conclude falsehood? Put it in another way, it is the correspondence of a proposition with reality in terms of how it captures the empirical evidence, which becomes the ultimate standard for judging truth. Sharply opposed to the empiricist position, there is an idealist learning perspective which raises some fallacies associated with the empiricist version, as Gaghan 2021 states that, open quote, telling the truth is not to furnish an accurate picture of what actually happened, but to participate in a set of social conventions, a way of putting things sanctioned within a given form of life. To be objective is to play by rules within a given tradition of social practices, close quote. In Gaghan's formulation, it would appear that a statement can be uttered to manipulate or conceal the truth, depending on the context and the interest of the bearer of the proposition. In similar vein, Davidson 2021 goes further to raise the problem of establishing what people mean by what they say. The author goes on to point that, but meaning not only is a more obscure concept than that of truth, it clearly involves it. If you know what an utterance means, you know its truth conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, some may be holding their breaths about where seemingly irreconcilable secular perspectives of truth are leading us to. To put your minds at ease, I do not intend to dwell on these debates any further. That could constitute deliberations for another day, not today. Instead, I will pause and draw two main implications for UNIZU Vision 27. Inspired by Angamula 2018 and Foucault 2017 discourse on analytical explanations, I make the following points. Number one, discourse analysts of Foucauldian persuasion contend that any proposition is a discourse that carries meaning are formulated within a given framework of reference. That is, the structure of concepts, values, customs, views, and so on, by means of which an individual or a group perspectives or evaluations data communicates ideas and regulates behavior. Thus, it should be borne in mind that any proposition, whether judged true or false, has this quality. The second point is Foucault brings another dimension, that truth cannot be separated from power. It is linked to the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. Angela Moore concurs that truth is a weapon that the powerful can use discursively. The example, Western claims of universal objective truth, is a true example of what I mean. I return to this point when I touch on where the less powerful and dominated, such as the case of the FMF students, stand in a truth regime where the less powerful are pitted against those who wield power. But first, what do the religious approaches say about truth? Now, I must tread carefully here. I'm not a foolish. As Pastor Naidu said. It has been argued that truth and religion are closely related phenomena, notwithstanding the fact that there is a variety of religious narrative genres. There are sufficient grounds upon which it can be claimed that it is possible to speak of discourses and practices being summoned under the same idea of religious truth. For the purposes of my talk, I will illustrate religious truth by drawing on theology scholars, in particular Christianity. That's mine. We have seen that while secular ideas on the truth lay emphasis on issues of intersubjectivity and variability of propositions, the Christian approach is premised on the idea, the true God. That's what Ogun 2020 says. When it comes to articulating the concept of truth, Ogun sees the Gospel of John as representative of biblical theology in general. From this, the author makes truth claims that 1, proclamation of the Trinitarian God, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit as one supreme being, as a biblical truth. Number 2, truth reaches the person on a relational basis and can bring the believer into a closer relationship with God and helps him to understand truth more fully. Number 3, John's Gospel understands truth as an absolute concept. It sets it apart from relativism and pluralism apparent in the secular approaches. Given the certainty and the trust and absolute depiction of biblical truth, some scholars have argued that to be true is not simply to be correct, but to be faithful as God is true in. Faithfully carrying out the promise of creation and human beings are true when their dealings are faithful with the conditions of God's promises. Flowing from the foregoing does not mean that a Christian believer has an obligation to always tell the truth. Can we think of a situation which demands that a Christian must not lie, but cannot always tell the truth? How is biblical truth to be understood and utilized in a revolution? Program director, although the sketch I've given about the notion of truth and truth-telling is not exhaustive, and the questions I pose need to be answered here, they serve to point to the complexities associated with the phenomenon of truth, whether secular or religious. They should also raise our awareness that truth can be understood and practiced from a variety of angles. Returning to my understanding of what seems to be the heart of today's topic, the question of countering truth-telling in revolution. This leads me to work out in my mind what is entailed by revolution in the first instance. As a corollary, and given my agnostic outline of truth and truth-telling, I feel compelled to turn to the question of how this relates to revolutionary praxis and the Unity Root Decolorization project. at this point that I put three main concepts together in a form of a nexus: revolution, decolonization, and truth-telling nexus. The case of FMF campaigns. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now share with you an equally vexing task with regard to understanding how revolution and decolonization sit in the nexus. Without veering deep into semantic and philosophical waters, and in order to peer into nucleus of the nexus, I would like to illustrate by drawing the insights of FMF activities some 10 years ago. The widely written and theorized Fees Must Fall campaigns is one area where scholars have come up with ideas which have to continue to influence policies and practices in higher education sector, stated and society at large. It has been argued that the heart of the students' campaigns were two broad issues: revolt against unaffordability of higher education and the coloniality of education that has seemed to continue to define the social cultural makeup of the university space in South Africa. I now deal with each of these two areas. Student funding issues. The FMM campaigns on funding were articulated as a cocktail of demands, which included the rejection of the proposed fee increases, cancellation of historical debt. They cited poverty and their inability to pay for education and were facing exclusion. All this happened against the backdrop of a country having emerged from apartheid system, which privileged historically white as opposed to black institutions. Moreover, the government in the 1997 White Paper 3 had committed to transformation that would address both inclusivity and quality in education. Faced with tough policy choices and political costs of ignoring or suppressing what has increasingly become seen as legitimate demands, political parties found it hard to distance themselves from what students were saying. In the end, the state capitulated and announced that the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS today, would fund all eligible post-school students whose household income started with 1,500 per annum, but moved to 3,500 or less. From this bold government action, however, other related broader student funding issues emerged, chief among which were questions of affordability, sustainability, and missing link. Those not covered in the definition of what was called or defined as poor. Although the debate and the practices about student funding have moved on since that time to date, on its part, the state authorities asserted that there was simply not enough money to cover the education of everyone, arguing that to fund everyone would be fiscally reckless since there was no likelihood of expanded fiscal provision through prevailing tax base, poor economic growth, and competing demands on the state's resources. Mutala, 2016. The point I would like to make in this connection is whether or not free education for all was unaffordable is hardly a neutral or technical determination, yet it was communicated as the truth. In this case, what society and students were being told is akin to the Foucauldian, as mentioned earlier, notion of a version of truth as a weapon of the powerful, which, it can be argued, was designed to conceal possible alternatives and to maintain the status quo. Juxtaposed against this state's position is the question of whether the students were telling the truth about their poor backgrounds and their inability to afford higher education, who was in a position to judge the truthfulness and the falsity of students' claims? This question becomes relevant in the light that, on one hand, recent developments to expand the funding to cover the missing needy, which I was part of, and the NSFAS efforts in verifying the authenticity of those who say they cannot afford. On the other, there's been an amazing revelation of what truth is and who tells the truth. Because when we started looking deep and comparing whose child is my tax funding, we realized that we are funding some people's children who can afford to buy all these wonderful cars. But where was truth in that? Apart from truthfulness or not, is the question raised by Ndlovu 2017 as to whether the FMF protests in and of themselves were a call for a revolution or reform. Ndlovu makes a distinction between revolution and reform. For Ndlovu, revolution entails an overhaul of the entire education system. It is also seen as taking the form of a sudden or unexpected dramatic change in the institutions or an immediate overthrow of the government. Reform, on the other hand, denotes a need for improvement, amendments, and fine-tuning, and in our case of our education system, leaving its basic characteristics or elements intact. In light of this history, can we say the FMF on student funding was revolutionary or reformist? According to Ndlovu, conceptualization of a revolution and the fact that there were ideological division among student protesters and reduced youth participation in the political public sphere could not have led to a revolution in South African politics. Open quote, 2015 FMF protests were not a revolution per se, as they did not lead to a sudden overthrow of the government or immediate dramatic transformation of other public institutions. We remained the same. Ladies and gentlemen, truth told or not by either government or students' movement, there remains a question about its status in revolutionary praxis. Let me now turn to the other thrust of FMF demands, which was a demand for decolonized quality education. The coloniality of education, they campaigned to decolonize higher education, citing the alienating epistemological hegemony of white Western thought in the university curriculum. Since the students' campaigns, there has been a growing body of decolonial scholars who have deepened our understanding on the politics of education as manifested Eurocentric curricula. Ndlovu 2021 deploys the concept of cognitive empire as a discursive tool with which to unravel dynamics and complexities of decolonization of education. Following Big Waitong's depiction of cognitive empire as an invasion of African mental universe, a cultural bomb which afflicted, open quote, epistemized killing of existing endogenous knowledges, linguistics, killing of existing indigenous languages, and imposing of colonial languages, culturicides, killing of indigenous cultures, and setting afoot cultural imperialism and alienation, exiling of indigenous people from their languages, histories, and cultures, even from themselves, quote, close quote. Two main implications can be drawn from the apparently intended nature of the colonial project. The first returns me to the notion of truth and truth-telling. If the cognitive empire distorted the consciousness of our relationship to the actual reality, what would it take to even, as the Western-trained academics that we are, tell the truth about the epistemic science that characterize our being, let alone exercise agency to rebuild authentic consciousness? In other words, we have to ask what truth, secular or religious, look like under the epistemic science. Given what I've just said, is it not reasonable to conclude that truth emanating from the epistemic science is another example of a weapon of the powerful? The second implication relates to the strategic question that can be raised regarding South African FMF call to decolonize education. Rugma 2020, in the article entitled Beyond the hashtag Fees Must Fall, International Students, Fees and Everyday Agency, in the area of decolonization, argue that decolonization of education cannot be limited to coloniality drawn national boundaries. The decolonial struggle should enlist support across international boundaries. South African higher education students share such with their counterparts in other parts of Africa. Closely related to this idea, Angakachalo argued following Fanon that to articulate colonial violence, a revolutionary antagonism is required to rupture the reproduction of truths and universalized through epistemic science. Such revolutionary practice cannot be achieved without mobilization. In this connection, revolutionary praxis is seen as a kind of internationalization, a pan-African struggle which can be waged to transcend truths as defined by the powerful. The issue of mobilization of scholars on decolonization is key to this if we are to find the truth and we are to move forward as the University of Zulu. I've said that when we had advocates gathered. I hope I've sufficiently peeled different layers of the nexus to the present, a version of understanding how truth, revolution, and decolonization interact. As I conclude, Program Director, I remain yearning for truths on how these can be utilized to discover and confront the dominant grand narratives that have been proven to drag Africans towards the mutilation of their humanity. UNISOLU has resolved to tackle this conundrum through the vision of building an African university, which is a node for African thought that can tell its own truths to be used in waging the twin problematics of revolution and decolonization. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, and thank you, distinguished audience. I'm particularly pleased by the Vice Chancellor's efforts to situate this forthcoming presentation in our very context, especially drawing down to issues of decolonization, epistemology, and the mission of this university to take this forward as we continue to give expression to our declaration that we are a node for African thought. The Vice Chancellor has set our minds up to consider the fraught nature of the key issues that are the center of the deliberations this morning. Truth, revolution, decolonization. Very fraught. These are issues that fill some people with anxiety. These are issues which, when deliberated upon, are likely to produce some discomfort because they touch on many, many uncertainties and they touch on issues of power as well. I am more happy that I am not the person who is going to take this forward. And I think we are qualified to both sophisticate and complicate the task at hand, these ideas. The presentation is titled No Shortcuts, No Subtitles, No Substitutes, Truth-Telling as Revolutionary Activity. And we have in our midst a theologian, a preacher, an intellectual, an author, a diplomat, all in one. If you take a look at the Wikipedia entry on our guest speaker, you will find, as I found, what I think I really liked about it is the photograph, the 1965 photograph. Very dapper, very cavalier, very debonair. But most importantly for me, I like the poise. I like that look of insistence, that look of determination, that look that has defiance, that's attentive, but that's also so clearly human. There is like flirting across the lips, a kind of smile to say, you don't have to fear me. I'm like you, if you know what I mean. Distinguished audience, distinguished guests, our guest presenter today is Dr. Alan Aubrey Bosak, who is a recipient of 14 honorary doctoral degrees. And if you were in Germany or Austria, in some of those countries, they would introduce him as doctor. They count all the doctors. If you have 2 PhDs, if you are a professor, they say professor, doctor. If you have 3 PhDs, they say doctor. So if we start counting these doctorates today, we will spend too much of the time here. He's also a recipient of more than 20 international awards. The Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award, Champion for Justice Award from the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Award from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the King Hincster Bravery Award from the Tulsa Royal House, and he has recently been inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. International Board of Preachers at Morehouse College, Atlanta, Georgia. He's also an award-winning author, having written so many books, at least 24 books, including Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters, Prophetic Critique on Empire, Resistance, Justice, and the Power of the Hopeful Season, Children of the Waters of Meribah, Black Liberation Theology, the Miriamic Tradition, the Challenges of the 21st Century Empire, Selfless Revolutionaries, Biko Black Consciousness, and the list goes on. He's expecting another book out soon, and it's titled The Scorched Earth Between 50 Years of Black Liberation Theology Through the Lens of Alan Aubrey Bosak. He has taught across the world and continues his teaching and preaching while remaining active in global struggles for human rights. He is especially active in the advocacy of Palestinian rights and freedom. And having served as professor of theology at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis in the US between 2012 and 2016, he is now a retired professor of Black Liberation Theology and Ethics at the University of Pretoria. Theologian in residence for the Samuel David Proctor Conference in Chicago, USA, and president of the Sankofa Institute for Pan-African Leadership and Prophetic Ministry. You can see that he is very well suited to give us a lift in our journey towards being a node for African thought. He's married to a renowned investigative journalist, Dr. N. Bosak. Please join me to welcome this unique preacher, theologian, intellectual, author, activist, diplomat, the Umfundisi, that's speaking to us this morning. Dr. Alan Aubrey Booker.
Vice Chancellor, Chairperson, honorable guests, colleagues, and friends, thank you so very much for the invitation to be with you this morning. I am very happy to be here, and I thank my friend and colleague, Professor Sipho Siepe, who first reached out to me and made it possible for me to come here. My thanks to Ms. Ngalwa Mkhanya, who was marvelous in arranging all of the logistics in order to get me here. I really do appreciate that. I thought I asked the chairperson to be short on the introduction, but as it is, I hope it is on tape, so that when I fight with my children, I will simply press the button and say, look who you are fighting with. Thank you, sir. I like that photo too. The smile may come every now and then, but that afro is gone forever. But I'm here this morning to share with you some thoughts and to be enriched by your engagement in what we have to say. And once again, congratulations to the Vice Chancellor for setting in motion such opportunities for thinking and engagement, which will be followed by action that will benefit not only this university, but all other places of learning in our country. It is desperately needed. Thank you for that. The title of this lecture reflects what I have learned from Black consciousness, which was also suggested by Professor Siepe, and through the years of my participation in our struggle for freedom, and I've come to believe increasingly over the last 30 years of South Africa's democratic experiment as a pastor, preacher, theologian, and an activist. There are no shortcuts to liberation and justice. There are no substitutes for the struggle for freedom, for equity, and dignity, just as there is no substitute for sacrifice. A true revolution needs no subtitles. The struggle, said Albert Luthuli, would be for freedom, justice, and human dignity, and there could be no substitute. We are bent on liberation. Truth-telling is a revolutionary activity. Steve Biko, following in the footsteps of Albert Luthuli, taught us that. When Biko says that the Black church did not understand Jesus or the Bible, and that our preaching and theology have made the Bible, quote, a poisoned well, that is truth-telling. When Biko states that Black theology sees Jesus as, quote, a fighting God who will not let the lie rest unchallenged, that is truth-telling. During the Black People's Convention trial, Biko, when asked what he thought about Black police in service of the apartheid regime, answered, in a courtroom packed with police, they are all traitors. That is truth-telling. Truth-telling is a revolutionary activity. The philosophy of Black consciousness demanded truth-telling about our South African situation, about white power, white supremacy, white privilege, and Black subjection to white domination. Biko's critique of white liberalism, whose messianic urges always got and still get in the way of black agency and hence black liberation from oppression was unsparing. But Biko was equally scathing of what we come to call the black condition. Consequently, in chapter 3 of Selfless Revolutionaries, the book that the chairperson has referred to, I speak of black consciousness as a fourfold consciousness: a critical, self-critical consciousness, a liberating consciousness, an empowering consciousness, and an engaging consciousness. Together, these three make of black consciousness a humanizing consciousness. One can also call it a revolutionary or a revolutionizing consciousness. But it begins with a self-critical awareness. Biko's first concern was to get to the issues that really mattered, what he called, quote, the first truth, bitter as it may seem, that we have to acknowledge, end quote. And it is the fact that black people, under the devastations of colonialism, have been robbed of their personhood. With apologies for the sexist exclusive language I now quote in extenso. Reduced to an obliging shell, the black man looks with awe at the white power structure and accepts what he regards as the inevitable position. Deep inside, his anger mounts at the accumulating insult, but he vents it in the wrong direction, on his fellow man in the township, on the property of black people. His heart yearns for the comfort of white society and makes him blame himself for not being educated enough to warrant such luxury. He has become convinced of the futility of resistance and has thrown away any hope that change may ever come. All in all, Biko continues to say, the black man has become a shell, a shadow of a man completely defeated, drowning in his own misery, a slave, an ox bearing the yoke of oppression with sheepish timidity. But Biko was not yet done. With the same stringent self-critical honesty, Biko observes, in the privacy of the toilet, his face twists in silent condemnation of white society, but brightens up in sheepish obedience as he comes out hurrying in response to his master's impatient call. In the homebound bus or train, he joins a chorus that roundly condemns the white man, but is first to praise the government in the presence of police or his employers. To hear this was painful, devastating actually, but it was nonetheless the truth. And those of us who understood and accepted it, and many could not, knew that we had to do more than just echo the Apostle Paul's lament in his letter to the Romans, quote, I do not understand my actions, wretched man that I am. We had to see clearly what we had become, what has made us so, and especially how we were complicit in our own condition. This is what black consciousness helped us to understand. What black theology did was to make us see how this situation alienated us, not only from our true selves as God had intended, but also from others, but above all from God. Black Christianity too did not escape. Biko accused the black church of conniving with an oppressive ideology and an interpretation of the scriptures that had become a depressingly efficient instrument for the subjugation of the people. We did not just accept, nor were we forced, we connived at what he called an appalling irrelevance of the scriptures, a, quote, colonialist tainted vision of Christianity, and had nothing liberating, comforting, or humanizing to say in a country, quote, teeming with injustice and fanatically committed to the practice of oppression, intolerance, and blatant cruelty because of racial bigotry, where all black people are made to feel the unwanted stepchildren of a God whose presence they cannot feel, end quote. The black church in its colonized existence was conniving but a form of Christianity that in its introduction was corrupted by the inclusion of aspects which made it the ideal religion for colonization of the people. But then he said, but nowadays, in its interpretation, is the ideal religion for the maintenance of the subjugation of the same people. And so, shifting from the work of white missionaries in the beginning, the nowadays focuses on the work of black preachers in Biko's day, meaning all of us that practice in the church. Biko accused the black church of no less than active participation in our own oppression. Hence, for us, the first step was the acknowledgement that indeed the most potent weapon of the oppressor was the mind of the oppressed. We have to begin with the decolonization of our minds, our grammar, and our actions, and understand that it begins with pride and dignity and self-awareness. So when former Minister Lindiwe Sisulu expressed her concern about the colonized mindset of some judges and politicians, and students are now insisting on decoloniality at every level, they are not really saying anything new. They are echoing Biko, but they are right. Liberation does not begin with the demonization of white people, I would say, but rather with learning and embracing the maturity of self-critique and putting an end to what Biko called the crime of our complicity in allowing ourselves to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of our birth, as Biko writes. For black theology, this means a new and right relationship with God and with the unashamed, unapologetic insistence upon the worthiness of our own black personhood. Biko's language is strong and brutally honest. Black people's complicity was connivance and a crime, allowing evil to reign in South Africa. The truth behind this truth is this: if it is us allowing it, it must be us putting an end to it. And putting an end to oppression is a revolutionary activity. And it begins with truth-telling. Now, this critical and self-critical awareness about ourselves, our faith, and our objective socio-political conditions was the bitter cup from which we had to drink in order to give life to that powerful force that changed a whole generation and the course of our country's history. Black consciousness, black theology, and black power. It revolutionized the struggle. It revolutionized a whole generation. It confronted whiteness with an unprecedented, relentless, and ultimately unstoppable force. Truth-telling is a revolutionary activity. The myriad dilemmas and challenges South Africa are facing today, I will pose it here, are all derived from one fundamental dilemma. That is our desire for shortcuts, subtitles, and substitutes. By 1985, it became clear that the Children's Revolution, starting in 1976, was not going to be yet another proverbial flash in the pan. It was proving to be a sustained, unrelenting onslaught on apartheid and all its structures and systems, all its suppositions and fundamentals, shaking its foundations to the core. The first state of emergency was the sign that the white minority apartheid regime understood this well. And that is why at the same time that they were killing our children in the streets by the hundreds, they also initiated those secret talks with the African National Congress in exile, making those elite deals for the benefit of the old established white elites and the new incoming black elites. But those secret deals are not a revolution, that's a shortcut. That is why, as I argue in Selfless Revolutionaries, we have an incomplete revolution. Shortcuts not only need subterfuge, they also need subtitles. There is much proud talk of our, national democratic revolution, but it needs subtitles, such as the politics of realism, negotiated settlement, and the even more deceitful rapid deracialization of wealth and capital. In truth, we know that we are sitting with a stolen revolution, supplanted by secret elite deals, balance of power agreement, and sunset clauses. Hence the need for what I call the politics of manufactured contentment, so deftly employed by the establishment since 1994. But the revolution needs no subtitles, and it has no substitute. The same is true of our failed reconciliation process. What we need, and still need after 350 years of the devastations of imperialism, colonialism, and apartheid, is reconciliation that is real and radical and revolutionary, as I wrote and made the title of a book, Radical Reconciliation, in 2012. We needed a process that would leave no single lie regarding our past and our present unchallenged. But that was too costly for South Africa. Because we looked for shortcuts, we opted for cheap reconciliation. We rushed to forgiveness, but we skipped the foundational elements of true, sustainable, and durable reconciliation, which actually produce justice, namely remorse, repentance, repair, reparation, and restoration. Because we did not seek reconciliation as distributed justice, the restoration of the land, of history, and of the dignity of our people, reparations for what was stolen from us, the decolonization of our politics, of the law, and of the courts, we sought refuge in subtitles and substitutes. The Rainbow Nation is not real. It serves as a subtitle for a nation not at peace with itself. Forgiveness is not real if it becomes a subtitle for forgetfulness. If the economy is run by a handful of white men, and when the vast majority of the land is still in white hands, serfdom is the substitute for freedom. Just how far have we sunk where the president hides millions of dollars in his mattresses, while the colonialist media tell us to look the other way? The Reserve Bank, SARS, and the NPA have lost their collective tongue, and those in parliament who demand accountability are ignored, outvoted, shouted down, and suspended. There is no substitute for dignity. Using the flag of anti-corruption and the pliability of the law to cover up the corruption of my cronies, simultaneously to get rid of political opponents like they did with Lula da Silva in Brazil, is the epitome of corruption. It is the most vicious assault on the democracy we are supposed to protect. But we are expected to remain silent. There is no substitute for revolution. Now, there was a time in South Africa when faith communities and educational institutions, universities and high schools, sometimes primary schools, lecturers and students, workers and the unemployed, people from all walks of life across the artificial barriers of skin color and race and culture, religion and language came together. We were the children of that consciousness. We saw the world of apartheid through the eyes of those who suffered from below, in other words, and we rose up in resistance. Our protest was relentless. There was a time when we faced tear gas and dogs and guns. We were imprisoned and beaten and tortured. We lived lives of self-sacrifice. We were purposeful. We felt the pain of our people. We shared their dreams of freedom. Through their eyes, we saw visions of justice and equity. We were not content with our unjust world. We knew we were not a people meant for oppression and tyranny and destruction. But that was before the days of euphoria and illusion. Before we told ourselves that a negotiated settlement signified the coming of the reign of God. before we decided that faithfulness to our people's sacrifices was too much of a hindrance to the profitable deals made with the old white apartheid capitalist class. That was before we began to use parliamentary privilege to disguise our crimes, before we left the field of battle to hide ourselves in the drafty caves of shortcuts and subtitles and substitutes. It is no wonder that we ended up where we are today as a country and as a people. We are a people severely diminished by politics without principle, leadership without vision, policies without commitment, and hence by failure after failure. We are drowning in corruption and lies and cover-ups. We are plagued by deceit and confounded by subterfuge. Our disastrous choice for neoliberal capitalism have deepened the generational impoverishment of our people, while the undeserved enrichment of the few continues, making us the most unequal society in the world today. We are once again approaching, it'll be in August, the commemoration of the Marikana massacre, an act that brought South Africans face to face with the painful reality that at the deepest level, there is no difference between the apartheid government they so deeply despise and their own democratically elected government they so desperately want to love. A shockingly short road from Sharpeville to Marikana runs straight from one pharaoh's hardened heart to another. It is all the more devastating because the voices that gave the command to shoot to kill came from our own. The hands that held the guns aimed at our people were those of our own. And up until today, this president, despite the emails and the promises, has not had the courage to go and look the widowed mothers and the orphan children in the eyes, to do penance and atonement through humility, justice, and reparations. But an even more disturbing question, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Is the blood on their hands also the blood on our hands? Because we voted for them, we trusted them, we called them our comrades and our leaders, and we have not as yet summoned the prophetic courage to call them all to account. Thus the question blood theology raises is this. What do we do when the Pharaoh of our enslavement looks like us? The same voices that shouted mayhem into the ears of our people in 1960 are the voices that now whisper betrayal into the ears of those we have chosen as our leaders. The evildoers of the apartheid violence still walk among us unrepented and untouched, expecting to be left alone to enjoy the fruits of their sunset clauses in quiet, wealthy solitude, not wanting to be reminded of what they had done. The evildoers of the renewed apartheid and the false new dawn are also among us, expecting our acquiescence, our votes, our trust, and our obeisance. They are only too eager to remind us how hard they have struggled for us, pretending that knowing the lyrics of struggle songs is the same as knowing the demands of justice. Sometimes I think the depths of anger in South Africa amongst our people, too deep to ignore, too inflamed to hide, reflect the depths of a trauma too much to bear. Truth-telling is a revolutionary activity. In the mainstream media, during the now infamous July riots, the condemnations for broken windows and burned down warehouses were incessant. But one listened in vain for one single sensible word of discernment on the 300 persons killed by security forces or vigilantes. Our courts, in far too many ways and far too many instances, are now the refuge of the cowardly and the ruthless, the untouchables and the unaccountable, a place where justice does not rise in light of righteous indignation, but rather cringes in the shadows of shame. Not many, not in politics or in the media or in the so-called thought leader class, saw and understood the signs of the times, then at the beginning of a reckoning many years coming. And what will eventually be the cost to our democracy of a constitutional court judgment that sneaks back one of the most despicable aspects of the apartheid era, namely detention without trial, as in the case of former President Zuma. Steve Biko's fear expressed in 1970 that if we only strive to get a black face in high office and nothing fundamentally changes, especially our economic system, South Africa would be exactly, he said, like yesterday. And that is the return of unfreedom, the return of submission to oppression and authoritarianism, which is enslavement. It is, by the same token, the ongoing impoverishment of the vast majority of our people, the ongoing colonization of our land, to say nothing of the recolonization of our mind. And that is why Black consciousness and Black theology have remained so resilient and so powerfully relevant. The renewed struggle for freedom, justice, and dignity is on, and Biko's words still ring in our ears, quote, "No nation can fight a battle without faith," end quote. Now the ANC had worked hard to eradicate the ideas of Black consciousness. It cast aspersions on his philosophy, it smeared his legacy, it tried to ignore and erase its power. I'll never forget the day President Nelson Mandela stood on that balcony in Cape Town, and there came a moment where he thanked all of those organizations that came together in the struggle to end apartheid. He mentioned a number of white organizations. He never mentioned once the Black consciousness movement, nor did he mention the name of Steve Biko. All to no avail, though, if in these past 30 years, the ANC had worked half as hard to honor the sacrifices and the ideals of our people as they did to please the whims and the demands of white apartheid capitalist classes, South Africa would have been a vastly different country. And this raises a crucial question Biko asked in 1970, quote, "Where do we go from here?" In 1994, the ANC ran with the slogan, "Ready to govern." Now, we are made to believe that the abuse of power, ignoring the Constitution, and staring into a pothole for 2 hours goes for governing. There is no substitute for dignity. Where do we go from here? With our country racked by revived racism, re-invited colonialism, re-embraced tribalisms of every sort, reinvented ethnic nationalism on the rampage. Our people have lost trust in just about every democratic institution we've had, including confidence in our independent electoral commission. Right now, as we speak, the doubts about the integrity of the recent elections are rising by the day. Before our very eyes, Parliament remained crippled by obfuscation and criminal abuse of power, unable to call anybody to account, including the president, stuff matters or not. What does it even mean when we see them raise their hands over their hearts or into the air, putting in the Bible, swearing loyalty to the Constitution? The assembly of the people, it seems, is constantly being turned into the assembly of the well-paid useless, going through the motions as if the people were a bunch of nitwits who cannot see through all of this. What South Africans now cynically call the politics of the stomach has overtaken and swallowed up whole the politics of decency, integrity, honesty, courage, and virtue we held up as our ideal during the struggle. There is a devastating truth spoken by African church father Augustine way back in the 5th century. I used it repeatedly in the 1980s against the apartheid regime. This is what he said: a government that does not know justice is nothing more than a gang of robbers. It is as relevant in 2024 as it was in 1985, as it was in the 5th century. We are ruled by a gang of robbers who have robbed us of the nobility of our struggle, of the hopes of our elders, the aspirations of our youth, and the dreams of our children. Somewhere between 1970 and 1972, Biko gave an interview in which he was eerily prescient. In it, he said, if South Africa were one day to have only a few black faces in office and not fundamental changes of economic policies, and allowing only a few blacks to become rich, and not a whole new economic pattern that will bring meaningful redistribution of wealth, opportunities, and power, our society will be run almost as if yesterday. I refer to that. After 30 years of democracy, South Africans now know for certain that a black face in office rather than a white one, as Biko has foreseen, does not guarantee justice and rights and dignity for our people. Our experience now teaches us that a black face in office does not guarantee economic opportunity or economic security and economic dignity for our youth. We now know for certain that what we have is not the democracy we were fighting for, but in fact, the fruits of what sociologist Patrick Bond called, quote, an elite transition from apartheid to neoliberalism, end quote. It is what the late, great, lamented Sampie Blanus of Stellenbosch University bluntly called the elite conspiracy between the African National Congress and the white political and economic establishment. In painful lesson after painful lesson, we have learned the difference between democracy and the right to vote, between the semblances of power and freedom. And so indeed we have today what Biko referred to as the few blacks filtering through into the so-called bourgeoisie, while the vast majority of our people remain mired in the misery of a failing democracy. Post-apartheid economic inequality has driven by increasing gains at the top, the experts say. But we should not be surprised. That is the nature of the new liberal capitalist beast. It should be shocking but not surprising that the recent report from Oxfam tells us that socio-economic inequalities, all in their own, socio-economic inequalities, not natural disasters like floods or drought or pandemics like COVID, socio-economic inequalities are responsible for the death of no less than 21,000 persons per day globally. That actually means one person every 4 seconds. If I were preaching, I would do this. Count them, church. 1, 2, 3, 4, a mother dies. 1, 2, 3, 4, a baby dies. What does that mean, though? When we know that South Africa is the most unequal society in the world today. We have glimpses. Not so long ago in the Eastern Cape, within a span of 14 days, 15 babies died of hunger. Of hunger. In a country with the highest number of dollar millionaires in Africa, making merry like there is no tomorrow. For me, a disturbing image comes to mind. Caesar fiddles, says it, while Rome burns. Here in South Africa burns while Caesar goes to the auctions. We should be clear. This inequality is by design. Just after 1994, the ANC was able to convince even some critical observers that it really had no choice. It was virtually being blackmailed by the West, the World Bank, and the IMF. I've never been entirely convinced by that argument. South Africa's new small black aristocracy, who have made such disasters if immensely profitable common cause with the old white capitalist class, have done so even though they knew that the heart of that system is endless greed, endless exploitation, endless carelessness, without which neoliberal capitalism simply cannot survive. Hence, we should not at all be surprised at what we see today, the bottomless corruption from top to bottom, the shameless cronyism, nepotism, and cadre favoritism, all sustained by a deliberate disdain for the poor and the vulnerable. Economist Guram Terborn has studied the work of the National Planning Commission. The Commission states, very matter of fact, in quote, that in 20 country should have a Gini coefficient of 0.6. This means, says Therbo, that in 2030 South Africa should continue to be the world's most unequal society. That means that government policies are designed to maintain the chasm between rich and poor, to throw up the barricades that protect the wealthy and keep the poor outside the wall and the walls of common privilege. If inequality is built into the system, it is unavoidable in perpetuity, or at least as long as the present system lasts. It also means that tinkering with the system and calling it reform should be totally unacceptable. What is required is total eradication of that system. For us, it means a total abandonment of the system, replacing it with a more just and equitable alternative. If neoliberal capitalism, new colonialism, and new imperialism are the subtitles to South Africa's freedom, and today's new apartheid leaders are the substitute for the old apartheid leaders, it means simply that we have no future. That is not what Steve Biko and that whole generation fought and died for, and it is not what this generation deserves. One of the things that strikes me more and more as I speak with our people across the country is the depth of anger, disillusionment, and hopelessness. We are, one young man said to me, constantly tossed between utter despair and boiling anger. At this point, the tomorrow, that future that millions have struggled, sacrificed, and died for, is hardly any different from the yesterday we rose up against. And it is for all these reasons that I speak of an incomplete revolution. Our revolution was hijacked, stolen, and domesticated beyond the recognition, subtitled with the equally denuded concepts of Ubuntu, reconciliation, and forgiveness, an orphan child standing alone in a make-believe rainbow with already fading colors. Speaking the words of our first quotation from Biko, perhaps 3 to 5 years before Soweto's children began to change history, Biko knew that the revolution had already started. That generation soon realized that to call what was happening a protest was inadequate. We began to understand that there are times when, in the word of black poet and philosopher Adam Small, protest can also be a form of begging. We stopped calling it a rebellion or even an uprising. We call it a revolution because we understood what began in Soweto would morph into the United Democratic Front, and it was a revolution of the people, but uniquely led by the youth of that time. We understood Soweto was not so much a place, but a condition of oppression and exploitation and marginalization, a condition of outrage and anger and despair, and that it was our duty to turn that condition into a condition of consciousness, of decision, and of resistance. Iranian scholar Hamid Dabashi suggests that we seek a new understanding of revolution. It is not as with the French or the Russian or the Cuban revolution, a moment of cataclysmic violence where one class is overthrown and replaced immediately by another in one single historical moment. He suggests that it rather is what he calls an open, ongoing work, the unfolding of an open-ended revolt, which finds resonance powerfully with the ongoing global resistance movement. It is, he says, a Palestinian intifada going global. So he's not looking at a revolution which is a momentary cataclysmic event. He says, look for it in the ongoing revival of the one phase after the other, and it never really ends until the people get what they deserve. That is, I suggest, exactly what we have seen since Soweto and the UDF, and now in the delayed defiance of countries such as Sudan, Algeria, Chile, Tunisia, Haiti. In our times, it is magnificently visible in the international manifestations against the genocide in Gaza, as it is always now more than ever present in Palestine as a whole. In South Africa, this revolution is such a delay defiance, taking new shape in the new post-1994 situation. And we have not seen the end of it, is what I suggest. Secondly, we understood that a genuine revolution was about fundamentally addressing and transforming systems of injustice, exploitation, and oppression into structures and systems of justice and dignity. We gradually came to understand that the issue is not just race, but also class. Over and above that, moreover, our understanding was shaped by what Chief Albert Luthuli called nonviolent militancy, and what Martin Luther King called a revolution of values: decency, integrity, honesty, courage, virtue, self-sacrificial love for one people. For such selfless revolutionaries, as Biko called them, people would be over prophets, justice would be inclusive and compassionate, dignity would be irreplaceable. For them, martyrdom would not be sought, but sacrifices, if called for, would be made. For we had learned from Albert Luthuli, quote, the road to freedom is via the cross. There would be no shortcuts, no subtitles, no substitutes. And this is the work done by what Biko called the selfless revolutionaries. Selfless revolutionaries would not ask what the people need, because they know that if we only work with what people need, it is always the powerful that determine and define those needs, as well as how and when and to what measure to respond to those needs. They would rather ask what the people deserve. For if we ask what the people deserve, it is not their needs but their rights, not their needs but their dignity, not their needs but their full humanity that matters. And that is what would determine our response. So if we work with people's needs, we keep them needy and dependent and powerless. But we know that in the words of the 1966 statement of the National Committee of Negro Churchmen in the United States, quote, powerlessness breeds a race of beggars. And empowering people means letting the people decide and make clear what they deserve. That is why in the Black Consciousness Movement, we did not merely speak of our ideal of a non-racial, non-sexist democracy as the slogan went. Our ideal was an open, non-racial, non-sexist, responsible, responsive, and egalitarian democracy. The omission of that crucial word, egalitarian, says it all today. It is not a revolution. It is a shortcut and a subtitle substitute. Radical revolution does not need that. It was also a revolution of values. It kept us keenly aware of the oppression of our people, but did not embitter us, so that we created space, even for our oppressors to join the struggle for freedom. We took Paulo Freire seriously when he reminded us of the historic obligation of the oppressed to free the oppressed as well as the oppressor. That is who a selfless revolutionary is, wrote Biko. And so we built the UDF that crossed all those barriers, and it became the largest non-violent, militant, non-racial movement in the history of our struggle. What South Africa now is going through at this moment is beyond disheartening. Especially now that more and more we are beginning to realize that the Zondo Commission has actually lifted just a carefully selected corner of the veil on the kind of corruption, the depths of which we could not even begin to imagine. It is disheartening because if the past is anything to go by, and there is no drastic course direction, there will be continued selectivity in reckoning, in accountability, and in justice that cause even more scandal on our justice system. And in analysis after analysis, Professor Siepe has made that brilliantly clear. But it is also ripping into our souls in ways that we were never prepared for. Now, I should perhaps just pause you to make clear that I do not mean that an incomplete revolution is the opposite of a perfect revolution. Brazilian theologian Ruben Alves is correct when he writes, What drives us is not the belief in the possibility of a perfect society, but rather the belief in the non-necessity of this imperfect order. It is the absolute dissatisfaction with our situation perpetually being almost as of yesterday. It is a dissatisfaction fueled by righteous anger because we know that it is the incompleteness in which the powerful and privileged prosper, but the poor and the oppressed, the defenseless and the vulnerable, the weak and the powerless are cast aside and left behind. It's not a perfectness that we are looking for, but it's striving toward wholeness, the openness to learning and unlearning towards a more whole becoming, towards, as Biko promised, gifting South Africa a human face. So there is still a tomorrow to talk about, even if, to quote Sia Kumalo, from this perspective, he says, the new South Africa is old South Africa 2.0, or as Conrad Koch describes the new South Africa's economy for white people, apartheid without the guilt. Despite the pain of disappointments and disillusionments and bewilderments, and despite all the betrayals, I believe the revolution of values retains its grip. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a young Christian theologian who joined the struggle against the Nazis in Hitler's Germany. From his prison in Berlin, which he would not leave alive, he wrote something that I repeat to myself as often as I can. Quote, there are people who regard it as frivolous and some who think it impious for anyone to hope and to prepare for a better future. They think that the meaning of present event is only chaos and disorder and catastrophe. And in resignation or pious escapism, they surrender all responsibility for reconstruction and for future generations. It may be, he says, that the day of judgment will dawn tomorrow. In that case, we shall gladly stop working for a better future, but not before. Hope has no substitute. It means having the imagination and creativity to work for the rebirth of the future, a rebirth of the dreams, of the ideals and hopes others have abandoned or sold out, but too many in this country have believed in, fought for, sacrificed, and even given their lives for. It means stubbornly clinging to and working for the possibility of making that hopeful, just, and peaceful tomorrow a reality. It means reclaiming that revolution. Ruben Alves says, this is what frees us from the shackles and enslavements of yesterday and makes each one of us tomorrow's child. And I quote, as I close, Augustine again. He said, hope is a mother with two beautiful daughters. The one she has named anger, and the other is named courage. The anger at what we see, what is wrong in the world, and the courage to rise up and do something about it. Hope is a revolutionary act. There is no shortcut, it needs no subtitles, and there is no substitute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Busa. I do not intend to trivialize that with what program directors often do, the recourse to semantic feeling. I think I'll let it sink as we prepare to get a response and to discuss for the time that's allocated for this webinar some of the massive, deep, profound insights that you have presented to us this morning. And so while the colleagues ruminate I'd like to now ask Professor Siete to proceed and give us a response. He will also carry on and facilitate a Q&A and contribution sessions thereafter. Prof. Siete.
Thank you very much, colleagues and the chairperson or program director. And also for suggesting that this should sync. I thought if you hold that view, it should take more than 5 minutes to sink in and also to make colleagues recalibrate their thoughts in terms of what is implemented. Socrates famously remarked, "I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think." I hope today's presentations will achieve what Socrates or something Socrates hope that will achieve, that to make us think. And that is precisely why the Vice Chancellor, in her wisdom, decided to say this university should also be a place of intellectual deliberations, where we engage with ideas that are not comfortable, where we comfort the disturbed, and also we disturb the comfortable. And one of the things in inviting the speakers, and in this case, inviting Dr. Busak, was also a recognition that history does not have blank pages or blank spaces. That we invite people who have been in the theater of struggle, people who have been in the theater of ideas, to provide us with their valuable lessons. Our colleague who's not here, but who claimed that he'll be on the Zoom, is wont of saying, and that's Professor Moyo, that actions without theory is activism, and theory without actions is verbalism. And today, we brought in somebody who cannot be accused of verbalism, or who cannot be accused of mindless activism, but who understands the importance of theory, who understands also why we must invest in thought. And when you read his paper, he keeps on referring to South Africa's post-1994 as a democratic experiment, effectively putting in the notion that it is something that we all must participate in. And the title of his presentation, when you see it, you have to find a sense of quarrel, which is what the Vice Chancellor, when he saw the title, was quarreling with. There are no shortcuts to liberations. There are no substitutes for the struggle for freedom, for equity and dignity, just as there's no substitute for sacrifice. A true revolution needs no substitutes, says Dr. Pusak. If one were to move to another grouping, to the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania, they will discover that the similar statement has been made by Sobukwe, when he says they, as the revolutionaries, they're prepared to serve, to suffer, and to sacrifice. So either way, what you find is a convergence of thought. But I would like to start from the beginning, to thank the Vice Chancellor for, as the chairperson put it, for situating the presentation to where we are as a university. And I was also impressed with the Vice Chancellor's, I wouldn't say attempt, but a way of trying to provide us with a lens to deal with the concept of truth. And part of it is because as a Vice Chancellor and a leader, an intellectual leader of the university, is also to remind us that this is a place of idea formation. This is a place of idea contestation. And that this is a place where we grapple when the idea of scholarship must come in. And Professor Shokani, as I was listening to the Vice Chancellor, I was asking myself, wouldn't it be nice that after such presentations, we end up with an occasional paper where we have a presentation followed by the presentation of a guest speaker? Because on its own, what was presented here is self-contained thinking that we should actually deal with. And the Vice Chancellor tried or succeeded in trying to bring what she calls a troika: truth, revolution, and decolonization. And I was pleased how she brought in the freeze must fall, or hashtag freeze must fall, to deal with the subject of today. Because it's always important to make sure that when we deal with these concepts, we ground them in our own realities. Because without doing so, we'll simply end up with what the Professor will call mere verbalism. And so the explication of concepts and of claims is our business. But it's also important that the Vice Chancellor situates this by making sure that we also engage in the manner where we read from the same page or read or sing from the same hymn sheet. I will not talk too much about the singing because I'm one of those persons who has the honor of being expelled from each and every choir. But there's something that the Vice Chancellor said, which Professor Dr. Busak, you'll have to deal with, is now and then the notion that truth as a weapon of the powerful, where so-called truth is used to conceal and to sustain injustice. So for that, the Vice Chancellor, we want to thank you for that leadership. One of the things that Dr. Busak tried to do, and I think is very important for our decolonial project, is to answer the question, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a revolution? And in our case, it is a revolution of thought. It's a revolution around how do we decolonize what we are dealing with. And in a sense, VC, if you were to think back in the discussions that we've had with our colleagues abroad, when we ventured into the idea of having a university that is completely decolonized, and also having to answer the question that Dr. Mzileni had also raised, whether institutions like this can actually, the colonial institutions can actually be decolonized or can be entrusted in decolonizing themselves. Because when we talk about people like Biko, we talk about Fanon, you discover that the decolonial project was carried out not in these institutions. It was carried in the theater of war, in the theater of struggle. And the struggle that also produced people like Dr. Alan Busak, because his engagement is not through binoculars, it's being in the center, in the theater of struggle. And that is a question that we must always raise. And we must always ask, to what extent can we, who are in the belly of the beast of coloniality, be entrusted with the possibility of decolonizing our states? And this is what the Vice Chancellor was also asking about what does truth mean. But we can then, as we did indicate to our colleagues, that the Black consciousness philosophy provided a lens in which we can rethink and relook. And this is what Dr. Busak was trying to say, that once you are imbued with a particular philosophy, with a particular theory, you are able to use that as a lens that assist you to making decisions, strategic decisions. And in a sense, what you are saying that they who were champions of black theology began to look at the Bible and the church differently. And as you put it, black theology seeks Jesus or sees Jesus as a fighting God who will not let the lie rest unchallenged. So if you have this consciousness, that consciousness should actually force you to be asking that what is it that you do in the classroom in light of this new way of looking? Because before then, what we were told is the Bible that was interpreted, where black people had to collude in their own oppression. And one of the things that in reading Biko, and thank you, Dr. Busak, for bringing us closer to what Biko, the questions that he raised, and the brutal truths that were, as you put it, were very uncomfortable and very bewildering. But it reminds me of what Malcolm X said about the new dispensation. But before that, you said, and this is also the question that we must ask when we deal with the university. It says the philosophy of black consciousness demanded truth-telling about our South African situation, about white power, about white supremacy, about white privilege, and black subjection to white domination. You know, I was saying to Dr. Busak that we're looking at how far back we go. And I was reminding me that it was actually 1985 in New York, and New York City. I was then at Albany, 3 hours away from New York City. And the person we were receiving at the time was Oliver Tambo. And I sat there and I looked at the program. And when I looked at the program, the speakers were as follows. One was the program director, and then it was the Jesse Jackson, and then it was Alan Bosak, and the third one was Oliver Tambo. I looked at that and I felt sorry for both Oliver Tambo and Dr. Alan Bosak, because anybody who knew Jesse Jackson at the time is that nobody speaks after Jesse Jackson. And when Alan was called, I looked down and I felt very sorry for him. And lo and behold, when he spoke, people started crying. And I asked, so why are you crying? He said, he reminds us so much of Dr. Martin Luther King. Says he takes us back to the 60s. That is what Alan, the contribution that he has made in shaping the thinking of the world around South Africa. And if you read his book and his paper, it has the same power that I saw when he addresses them. So, but what he says, which is critical, is a statement that says what white liberalism gets in the way of black agency and also black liberation from oppression. It gets in the way. You could also be thinking about what the Vashan says, that the coloniality gets also in the way of our own liberation. So that is a very critical. And Malcolm X put it differently, where he warns us about the ease with which we acquiesce and we become comfortable in spaces that are not our own. And Professor Ntomela will know that I like quoting what Malcolm X says, that having an opportunity to ride either on the front or the back or the middle of someone else's bus does not dignify you. When you have your own bus, then you have dignity. When you have your own school, you have dignity. When you have your own country, then you have dignity. When you have something of your own, you have dignity. But whenever you are begging for a chance to participate in that which belongs to someone else, or that which belongs to someone else, on an equal basis with the person, that's not dignity. So when we get into these buses that are not our own, the question is, how do we change them? So what we presented in this morning is what I may call a template of what emerged from Black consciousness. And here's a template of that Dr. Busak put. And I'm just doing this as a way of reminding, and that is, I pose this. There are 4 things that he said. First, it's about critical consciousness, the importance of critique. Then the second one, he says, it's about self-critical consciousness. That it is one thing to critique something that is out there, that we need to be unhappy with these conditions. But he also says, to what extent are we also conniving with those conditions? And hence the notion of a self-critical consciousness. And then you can then move to the next levels of a liberating consciousness and also an empowering consciousness. But it cannot come without engagement. So part of the engagement that the people that Dr. Busak were engaged in is that which allowed them to start creating a new possibility, a new approach towards liberation. And of course, he concludes by saying, during that time, we did not just accept, we forced. We connived at an appalling irrelevance of the scriptures, a colonialist tainted version of Christianity. And when you look at that, that is what called for a revolution against that. And he says, as Bigo put it, hence for us, the first step was the acknowledgement and indeed to accept that the most important weapon of the oppressor was the mind of the oppressed. So if you go back to our decolonial project, it involves also all those elements. And the first of which is a critique, but also to be self-critical in where we become complicit from our own liberation. So I thought we need to understand that. And when we become self-critical, you should go back to what Bigo said, that, or what Alan was saying, that Bigo's language was strong and brutally honest. And this is what we need, to be brutally honest with ourselves. But Alan, what I have also reminded my colleagues is that truth telling, which is in a crisis, is also a very dangerous proposition. Those who engage in the business of going around telling the truth, they know what happens to them. I'll stop there. In the methods of these lectures, we often invite, after the speaker and the speakers have spoken, and the interventions by our colleagues. And right now, I would like to invite interventions. They could come in the form of questions. They can come in a form of comments. And when I say comments, I'm not talking about only comments that are agreeable. I'm also talking about those comments that are disagreeable. I can assure you that you'll come out of this place alive. Any comments?
I'm not sure if I call it also an organic intellectual. Because for us, looking at you, like who has wisdom, you've been there, actually, you've lived about you've lived during that time. And we know you were a boss, we were a voice that resisted the oppression, even till today, the ongoing coloniality, racism, inequality, and justice. And there's something which, like, I think in one of your quotes when you're saying, like, now you as a pastor in your liberation theory, that when you go to him, God will ask, where are your wounds? And you will say, I have no wounds. And God will ask, was there nothing worth fighting for? And Dr. Busek, I know you fought for lots of things, but we could pick up, there are still lots of wounds. And especially like now at our age, I want to say we're at the crossroads actually, with our future. Maybe in a way of reconciling the past and what happening now, especially for us as academics. How do we continue to challenge the hegemony of ideas and the mass consensus around the interest, like now the ruling class? And like for us now, it's as the node of African thought we see, where we should become a site for like an intellectual site where, yes, we agree there were lots of things which were not right with the past curriculum. You know, we talk about that. But like now we're in a situation where it's us actually who should bring all those things in the classroom and change the narrative. But what is it that one thing, Dr. Busak, that with the wounds that you were talking about, because like us, I think we're battling with the wounds and healing. Does it mean now when we heal, we forget the past? We forget what has been done to our parents? We forget the issue of the land? We maybe I don't want to say we're confused, but we actually don't know actually how to proceed.
Yeah. Well, what I'm going to do is to ask Dr. Busak to respond to that, and I think you should come here. And because time is against us, I'm going to ask Professor Kume he has a comment, then he can simply summarize that. Can you? Oh, there's a hand.
There's a hand.
Oh, I'm told that there's an irrepressible hand that refuses to go down. Can you press and speak? Okay. And there's a pressure to ask us to continue for another 20 minutes. VC, I'm told that is your call, is not my call, to entertain at least one or two questions.
Professor, there is a man here in the house that has got power vested in him,
Okay.
and that is called.
That's a program director.
Yes.
Okay. And can you have that question then ask Dr. Busak? And I'm not going to, you can come here. Ask the question, sir. Oh, man. Oh, Professor Kuzwayo.
He's just muted.
You are muted, Prof. Kuzwai.
Maybe it was by mistake.
Yeah. Oh, it's a mistake. Okay, Professor Dr. Kuzwayo, continue. Is he able to speak?
She has unmuted.
Doctor? I think you should proceed.
Okay, thank you for that question. I mean, that thing about the wounds is a thing that has kept me busy for a very long time. It's not just the wounds, it's what follows. Is there nothing to fight for? So every time one observes an injustice being done and oppressing people's minds or keeping people's minds in a state of control of others, not allowing them the dignity of thinking for themselves. And this is what this university was doing. Equip students to help think for themselves, to relate what we talk about here to the realities that they know. Now, you don't have to teach many children what poverty is, but you can teach them what the real causes of poverty are. It's not that their parents were lazy, it's not that their parents were not educated, it's not that they are lazy, it's not God's will, it's not a predetermined historic position. There is a history of 350 years of undeserved wealth gathered in the white community on the backs of undeserved impoverishment carried by the blacks and by the indigenous people as a whole. It's a historic thing that one can analyze. It has spiritual aspects to it, because if I say to people that in Jesus' first sermon, recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, where he speaks in the synagogue, he talks about the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and then the first thing he says to bring good news to the poor. I always make a point of saying to, when I preach to people, that does not mean that Jesus is saying to you, it's okay for you to be poor, because in heaven there will be untold riches. That's what Jesus said, that's what white missionaries told us. And so they make you sing all those songs about the golden streets of Jerusalem while they steal all the gold from right under your feet in your own country. No. So those are the things that we can teach our students. There are analyses that we can make. The spirituality of it is important. I mean, I wrote a book with the title, The Tenderness of Conscience, and the subtitle was The Spirituality of Politics, because that's always been so important for us. Now, if you have a revolution that has no spiritual roots, that's when you get pure anarchy, and that does not help. What you need is something that is far deeper and far more rooted. So the question about the wounds is not just about my wounds, it's the wounds I see being inflicted on everybody else. Let me just say one more thing about that. In my theological tradition, the father of whom is a man called John Calvin, he said a few things. One of the things he said is this. He said, because every human being is not just a reflection of God. He says when God looks at us, human beings, God's children, it is as if God looks into a mirror. That's how intimate that is. So he concludes and says, so every injustice inflicted upon any child of God is a wound upon God himself. And then he says something else that blows my mind. And so my conclusion, therefore, is think about it. If I then heal the wounds by turning an injustice into an act of justice, by turning an indignity into dignity, and those kind of things, if I do that, I'm not just healing the wounds of the person or the society, I am actually in the process healing the wounds of God. I mean, can you even think what that means? Now, if that is your revolutionary driving force, that's not just passion for revolution, that's pathos. That goes much deeper. And I've always tried, way back from the 1970s, 80s, I mean, I came back from Holland in June, 2 weeks after Soweto, 1976. By July, I was standing on the table at the University of the Western Cape talking about what this means for us. And from that time, I'm a goner in that sense. I mean, I couldn't help myself. I was drawn into this up until this day. And what, more than 50 years of activism. And so I've learned this. And so look at the wounds. And it doesn't mean some wounds we can heal. Other wounds probably will remain. Say for instance, we get the land back, because that's one of the crucial issues that I think is keeping South Africa from being healed, is that restoration, that that repair, that reparation, that goes to healing. It's the land, and you heard me in the lecture, it's the land, it's the dignity, it's all sorts of things. But so even if we get the land back, my grandfather from my mother's side had land along the Olifants River. That piece where they lived as a community was taken away from them by the Group Areas Act, and the Dutch Reformed Church, the white Dutch Reformed Church, settled its own people on the land of our people there. Today it's called Lutzville, it's a thriving community, they produce this and they produce that. Yeah. Okay. So my grandfather was moved away from there to a very desolate place. And I never as a child could understand when she said that my grandfather died of a broken heart. And when I got older, I understood it was because his love for the land that he was privileged to cultivate and to be there, that was taken away. It took away his understanding of himself and his connection to the land that was so precious. That broke his heart. Now, I can get that land back if we fight hard enough. But my grandfather's broken heart, that's the kind of wound that I'm talking about. But whenever you think of that, and the idea there is also never to think of your own wounds as the most important thing. It's always the wounds of others that drives you. So in the process of healing others, you will find in many ways healing for yourself. At least the resilience to not flinch if there's another wound coming because you're standing in the way of somebody who's been hit. If that makes sense.
So Dr. Busak asks if we are done. I don't think we will ever be done with asking questions to you, sir. Maybe in terms of the time, again, colleagues, let me apologize for the time we've gone a bit over. Sometimes these things occur. The purpose is to make sure that we do not depart from the purpose. And I thank you, Prof. Shokani. There's a lot of investment, both intellectual, administrative, financial, in getting these organized. And we would really like to achieve those purposes. Thank you, Vice Chancellor. With your kind permission, which has been granted, I'm going to ask Professor Nicolaides to make a 1-minute intervention.
Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate it. Dr. Busak, congratulations on a wonderful presentation, highly thought-provoking. Congratulations for your fortitude and the stand you have taken in South Africa your entire life, past, present, and future. It's absolutely unbelievable, the things you've achieved and will still achieve for this country. I just wanted to ask you very briefly, in what way do you think we can break down this pervasive ethic, narcissistic ethic of self-preservation, where people are just thinking of me, myself, I? Because this, in fact, is the elephant in the room when we talk about oppression of others. And it's a global condition. It's not just in South Africa where we've had this. This happens all over in different ways. So very briefly, in sort of one sentence, what do you think we should be doing other than praying and being forceful in our faith? Thank you.
Before Dr. Busak responds, can I... Professor Kuzwa is back with her hand up. Yes. Does the Vice Chancellor want to speak?
No, I don't. I'm doing this for.
Okay. I would also ask Prof. Kuzwayo to make a comment with the same brevity as Prof. Nicolaides. And I will ask myself to make my comment with the same brevity. And then we'll ask Professor Busak, not so brief, to make his responses. Then we may leave if the Vice Chancellor permits. Yes. Prof. Kuzwayo, your hand is up. We called you earlier. Please go for it. You have 60 seconds. It's going. It's going. It's gone. Okay. So this will be my brief comments, Prof. Dr. Busak. We want you to cap it. Sit at the head of the table. I am particularly fascinated by your reference, by your use of when you say no subtitles. What it means for me, and you could comment on this, is an aspect of the work we have been doing that I carve out for myself in terms of, and you also said we need to decolonize our grammars. Professor, remember when we were engaging with Faculty of Education last week or so, we talked in the original units in the Charter on Decolonization in 2022, we talked about grammars of change. So being also with a little background in language, I find that very fascinating. And the way I understand you is when we use subtitles, we engage, or when people use subtitles, they engage in a linguistic, a semantic mediation, whose attempt can be interpreted in terms of subterfuge, to reduce, to water down, and maybe to change at the end of the day people's ideas, to fool people. And I think that's what you also mean when you talk about politics of manufactured contentment. The linguistic, the language, the discursive practices carried out mostly by the mainstream media, which you also make references to give people who are suffering an idea that they're not really suffering. To give people that actually what we call, especially when Black people face racism, to say, no, it's not racism, you're being too sensitive. This is the new South Africa, there's no more racism. Those kinds of discursive attitudes. And I also think it means, in a more serious sense, the issue of idea formation, which Professor Ekem always refers to, and which I think we want to be a node where Black thought informs idea formation and theory building. And I will link it again, finally, Professor Ekem, we were talking last week with Faculty of Education, and I really like Professor Ntombela's brilliant response to the idea of the box which you brought. So I'm thinking the dignity would come, especially as intellectuals, especially as agents in epistemological processes, not so much in being the lead explainer of Foucault or the lead explainer of some other idea, but to be the purveyor, to be the originator of an idea yourself. And I think then we'll be doing truth-telling in the way you see it, and you articulated it, and we'll be resisting the recolonization of our minds, which I find a very powerful point as well, because we have to admit that there were successes in the process of decolonization. But what you have said makes me really disturbed to observe a trend of recolonization, such that it seems we are losing even that we had previously gained. We seem to be losing it in the present day. So Dr. Busak, you have the floor for an unlimited 2 minutes to give us your response.
Thank you so much for all of the questions. Professor Nicolaitis, I don't know how one does that, except that one persists. There are, of course we pray, but for me, prayer is learning to put myself at God's disposal to do the things that will make God feel at home in our midst, that kind of thing. So it's always saying to the students in the 1980s or whatever it was, we come in the chapel and we pray for tomorrow's march, because you must know how you are anchored. There's no way of explaining away the dangers that they will be going into. I mean, I have had students who were in the chapel praying with me on Sunday night, and there's a march on Wednesday, next Saturday there's a funeral. You see what I'm saying? So that thing makes you also understand. When we say things, you must really try to live that out. That's why the UDF was so important to me. We talked about non-racialism, but it was a reality. In a way that we have, I'm sorry to say, deliberately turned our backs on since the 1990s. So in an institution like this, returning to those things, it's not as if it's an ideal that is unreachable. We actually had it. We could actually taste it. And so it goes above ideological things. And so if we can make people believe that it is not an impossible dream to make it happen in this country, but it is possible for people with commitment to do that. This whole thing of decolonizing education and history, I mean, I always go back to things that I have said and written sometimes and preached before my mind was completely formed on these issues. So I can see what you were saying there. I put something. No, you can't mislead God's people like that. So recapturing your own mistakes, understanding them, studying them, recognizing them for what they were. That's part of it. So I find myself going back to texts that I have preached in the 1970s. I read that text very differently now, and I preach it very differently now, because I have a much greater understanding of what the situation not only was that in the biblical context, but how you apply that to our context right now. So the re-education, you will hear me say there's a process of learning and unlearning. I actually have a lecture that will come out in the volumes that you mentioned, but the subtitle, Learning and Unlearning, because that is a process. And people who teach students have to be very clear about that. Yeah. So meetings like this, discussions like this, not only about logistics or admin stuff, but about these fundamental issues. Not only how we teach, but what do we teach? What have I learned from my own experience and from my own better reading? That book that I have out now, Self-Will Revolutionaries, I've been quoting Biko like forever. But when the students with the hashtag Peace Must Fall thing came, I heard them. They quote Biko, they quote Fanon, and then I think, you're not right. He didn't say that. Well, he didn't mean that. So it forced me to go and sit down and reread Biko. So that book is a close reading, as close as I would ever come to rereading Biko and to understand why his ideas are so powerful even today, and why it fires up students even if they don't completely understand what it is in saying. But in order to have a conversation with them now that makes sense about Black consciousness, about colonization and recolonization, because our political process for the last 30 years was a recolonization process, without a doubt, in every single way. And that's why we cannot get away from apartheid. And we don't say apartheid anymore, you say we make our judgment based on meritocracy, like that one political party keeps on saying. But what is meritocracy? If you de-historicize it, if you depoliticize it, if you don't take into account that this child from the township school will never be able to compete on an equal level with a child that comes from a white school. I mean, it's clear. You see the assignments, I see the assignments. I see the difference in my students. This child I can see immediately, oh no, she comes from this latest rich people. She was in a private school or a previous model C school. The child from the township school, that will even to grasp the concept. And so I'm lucky, I'm not talking about you guys, you sit with 200-300 students. I sit with only maybe 6 or 7. So I can go back to that child and say, this assignment is not right. I don't want to give this mark to next to your name. Do you mind, can we talk about this again? So we have maybe 2 or 3 separate occasions, one-on-one, and we go through the thing. And it's amazing how enthusiastic they become for their studies and to learn this thing. And I teach Black theology at Victoria University for other Black age, you can even begin to imagine that. And ethics. And I talk about something like the peculiarity of Blackness, which is every says that. Now, students are fascinated by that, but they don't know what that means. But it's a lovely thing to explain what that means, and to explain to the students, it's not just about blackness now, that peculiarity, that specific kind of history, with that specific kind of suffering inflicted upon a specific kind of people. That's true for women as well. Think about it. And so when you can do that with the students, it's for me, it's actually a wonderful thing. And so for us, re-educating ourselves on a constant basis, engaging with one another on a constant basis, tackling not only the difficult questions I heard you say, Vice Chancellor, but the desperate questions. That is the issue, and not shying away from them. So I'm hoping that would be the foundation upon which you build your effort to really decolonize this institution.
Well, I intended to say something, but Dr. Busak has made sure that I say nothing. And I'll deal with him after this.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, one more time, please. I would now like to invite Professor Jata to give us a vote of thanks.
Program Director, please allow me to say all protocol observed. Mine is a small task of proposing a vote of thanks, which I must indicate. I will not be summarizing the speakers' points that they have raised. I'll just go straight to the point, to the task at hand. Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, for leading from the front, the exemplary leadership. Really indeed for showing us all the time that the strategic vision impacts all of us in our university. It impacts all the units, and it should guide all the units. The issue of decolonization, the Node for African Thought, it problematizes all our fields of operation and expertise. We really thank you for that. And as indicated, we do have a series of these webinars. We had the first, which we're looking at to a greater extent, it was more on the legal side, and now we are looking at the side on the religious side, and that brings to on behalf of UniZulu, Dr. Busak, that I would like to express our sincere gratitude for your very contribution as a respected guest speaker. We really appreciate the work that you have done for us, and thank you very much, Prof. Siepe, for making sure that we always organize the prominent people to come from different perspectives as we drive the university strategy. Professor Siepe and Professor Akpome, these colleagues are the foot soldiers. And I really want to thank them for their dedication, commitment, as well as the time that they have done in driving this project for the University of Zululand. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your service. And lastly, allow me to thank all who have contributed to this event. The organizers, of course, how can I forget Ms. Lungelo Mangai, the driving force on this project, the CMD colleagues, as well as the ICT colleagues, and every other person who has put this kind of a show. We really appreciate it. And all attendees, both physically as well that are attending online, we really thank you very much. We'll continue and driving the project of the university. We really, really appreciate it. As the second part of my task, of course, was to close this session. It is indeed my honor to bring this second Vice Chancellor webinar series to a close. And thank you very much to everybody for the attendance, and also to hand it back to the chairperson if there are any announcements. Thank you very much.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
Colleagues, the last part of the show is to really do it our way as UNISU. For our guest, Dr. don't allow them to live badly. They came here carrying something in their bellies. And therefore, we like to give you something because my understanding of what happens to preachers is that you give on Sunday your all, and on Monday you are left dry in your bed. The congregation is not there to say, hello, we had what to say, we had what to say, and we appreciate you. And it is that busy that we'd like to say, carry this home and say, you were here, you were at Unizu, and we really appreciate you.
ish umnyala light wehlisi yabo namadoda ukushutha wona abe mina ngigijima ngale light ngiyibeka ngale uyivale phansi ish ngithatha le ngicela uze nayo ngale